Please turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We have a few folks not here as they are away at another camp. This is a camp that about 3 to 4 area congregations are working together with, and they are actually at the Childersburg Church of Christ camp. And they will be conducting a VBS one day going up to Rainbow Omega to work. And so it'd be a kind of unique and different camp. It'd be about 3 days. And Tim is preaching tonight at the worship assembly there. But I just think Tim's brave. A week at Indian Creek Youth Camp, and he was counselor and teacher and etc. And you know he came back absolutely exhausted, and with only 1 day rest, then to go to another 3-day camp. Like I say, brave fella. 2 weeks camp in a row for folks that are above 18 years old is tough. Appreciate what he's doing. In our study of 1 Corinthians, and a reason for study of 1 Corinthians, as this concerns the Bible Bowl material for our lads to leaders. So it's opportunity for us to study this, and then they kind of are hearing it again as they are studying it in their classes. We're trying to look at a chapter a week, and frankly, when you get to chapter 7, you see verse 1, well, they all have a verse 1, but they don't all have a verse 40, not in 1 Corinthians. This is a very long chapter. Basically, its rival would be chapter 15 with 58 verses. But such a long chapter that we're basically going to be able to read some paragraphs, make a few comments, and then have to quickly move on from there. The entirety of this chapter is basically in some way dealing with marriage. Now there's a little kind of paragraph that's not as strict about marriage. That's from verses 17 through 24. But then there's elements there too, yet dealing with marriage. It's dealing with various aspects of marriage, and some things of which you find more pointedly here than any other place in the New Testament. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the matter about which you wrote." This "now concerning" is also found in chapter 7, verse 25, with "now concerning the betrothed." In chapter 8, verse 1, where it says, "now concerning about food sacrificed to idols." And you find it in chapter 12, verse 1, "now concerning spiritual gifts." And then in chapter 16, verse 1, "now concerning the collection." I appreciate it when a translation keeps it uniform, "now concerning." It's actually the best way to translate, but then the reader can kind of key in on these words that are the same, introducing a new subject, and knowing that right here, he says, "now concerning the matters about which you wrote." Now we know in chapter 1 that the household of Chloe had let him know some things, and probably kind of up to this point, it's maybe some things he had heard from the household of Chloe. Certainly and absolutely, he knew about the division that existed in the church there from the house of Chloe. But apparently they too had written him a letter saying, "well, what about? Well, what about? Well, what about?" And so he's now answering these questions that they had had. And this first one here, like I said, chapter 7 is basically about marriage. When you get to verse 25, where you get a "now concerning" again, it's now concerning the betrothed. But once again, it's still having to do with marriage, but it's a little bit more kind of specific. Let's read now verses 1 through 5. "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, obviously, it doesn't take but a hurried reading to see that he's speaking of an intimate part of marriage. And he's very plain in his discussion of it. Now, as he starts out in verse 1, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Somebody might walk away and say, wait, is he saying here he does not want man to be married? Well, you know, in verse 8 it says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single as I am. And then as you get over to some other verses, like you get over to verses 26 and 27. Well, verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? In other words, unmarried. Do not seek a wife. And then as you get to verses 32 through 37 or so, you again read his reasons that it may be good not to marry. But much of this has to be considered in the context of verse 26. He says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. In other words, unmarried. The present distress. Now somebody says, what is the present distress? He doesn't define it. I don't have an adequate answer, a definitive answer. If I can put my foot down and say, here is the present distress. But it was something that would have made being married and being Christian much more difficult. He as well points out kind of another reason that the man married, he's got to give attention to his wife. And in so doing, he can't give quite the attention maybe to the Lord that he otherwise might be able to. He's not saying, men, you can't marry. He's not saying, women, you can't marry. Rather, his judgment, his opinion, the difficulties that are at present, it may be best not to, or to wait. By the way, many people, well, you know, from the moment Tish asked me to marry her, I'd like to have gotten married right then. But she still had a semester of school to finish, and I was in South Carolina, and she was in West Tennessee, and you know, it just kind of was best we waited for her to graduate, where she could, when we married, her join me. Many people have had reasons they had to wait or postpone. Present distress. But then as he discusses this intimate part of marriage between a husband and wife, you know, he's kind of clear, isn't he? And somebody might object and say, well, I don't like this. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. But do you realize then he says the same thing about the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does? I suggest to you, compared to many cultures in that day, he has elevated. He's elevated the state of a woman by, in essence, making them, with regards to the marriage bed, equal. The husband doesn't have authority over his body, but the wife does. The wife doesn't have authority over her body, but the husband does. You know, when you read this, frankly, I have to come away from this thinking, the husband's idea is, I want to please my wife. And the wife's idea should be, I want to please my husband. And if a husband has that idea and a wife has that idea, it does not get any better than that. Now, he's talking here, frankly, about the marriage bed. But in all of marriage, if we can get in our minds as husbands, I want to please my wife. And if the wife has the intention, I want to please my husband. It doesn't get any better than that. And that's the way God wants, and that's the way God intends for it to be. We find Hebrews, if I were going to say, a one-verse commentary on these verses, be Hebrews 13, verse 4. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But could it be that we abstain from one another for a time? You know, he addresses that. You both agree to it. And it's got to be for a high purpose, to devote yourselves to prayer. But then he's cautious. You come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now beginning in verse 6 and reading. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of the other. I find this verse very interesting. Kind of two reasons. One, the way he starts out, I wish everybody was like me. Most of us wouldn't be so bold to say that. But he was speaking within the context of he's unmarried. And this goes along with the verse 1. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, not to be married. And we do find this would acknowledge basically he's not married. And then in chapter 9, verse 5, he's not married. Now sometimes people go to Acts chapter 26, verse 10. And from that they deduce, they say, well, it would apparently be that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sanhedrin had to be married. And so then they kind of go from there and say that, okay, married in Acts 26, but in 1 Corinthians 7, maybe a widower. It may be a bit of making an assumption or two about the Acts 26:10 that he's married. But it's not without reason and cause that people suggest that. But certainly at this point in time, he's not married. Then it says, but each one has his own gift from God. Now remember, he's talking about being married, not being married. And it's almost like he's saying, you who need to be married, it's a gift from God. You who don't need to be married, it's a gift from God. Now, I wish we had more time. We just don't. Because as a part of a study of marriage, I always suggest you go back to Mark 10. And you read Mark 10. Then you go over to Matthew 19. And you read each of those passages, because there we find the Pharisees asking Jesus a question about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and then his answer. Then he even talks about some being eunuchs, the idea really of not marrying. And then gives different reasons. But if somebody feels the need, yes, to be married, that's okay. And then it's okay to be married. And I think that based on this, you could look at it as God gave me this gift. But then there's some who, frankly, they don't need to be, don't want to be. And I think as I look right here, that's okay. And you know what? We need to make sure that if people choose not to marry, they know that's okay. That's okay. In fact, they could look at it as their gift. Now, I know someone might say, wait. It doesn't say this gift, just the need to marry or not the need to marry, but that's within the context, isn't it? Okay to be married, okay not to be married. What is your gift? Verse 8, to the unmarried and widows, hope you're looking at your text, but unto the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I. Once again, his emphasis on not marrying. But if they cannot exercise control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, actually, it's better for them to marry than to burn. The with passion is basically, or with lust, depending on the translation you're using, kind of supplied by the translator. But most people agree that that's what he's in reference to. But somebody's going to say, wait, preacher. But if people cannot, they don't marry, but yet they cannot contain, and then they live a life of fornication, they're going to burn in hell. Somebody might say, preacher, I think that's what it's talking about. Well, I think both is true. Both is true. Verse 10, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. And I know that we kind of scratch our heads and say, what's he mean here? I give this charge, but not I, but the Lord. Well, the Lord himself had discussed marriage. Mark 10, 1 through 12, Matthew 19, 1 through 12. So the Lord has discussed the subjects, and Paul is acknowledging the Lord's discussed this subject. Now, Paul was an inspired apostle of Jesus Christ. He was able to, as Jesus put it in Matthew 16 to the apostles, they would bind things that had been bound in heaven, loose things that had been loosed in heaven. So they would be making known God's Word. In this case, the Lord's already talked about it. And what does he say? He said the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Now this just goes back, doesn't it, to that basic teaching of marriage that you'd find from Jesus in Mark 10, Matthew 19. Oh, by the way, this basic teaching of marriage went back to what was in Genesis chapter 2, and then later Paul quotes it in Ephesians chapter 5. That the two should be joined and become one. And as you examine everything about that passage in Genesis 2, and as Jesus applies it, as you read in Mark 10 and Matthew 19 and Ephesians 5 from Paul, it's clear. God's intention was the man and the woman to marry and to stay married. And essentially that's what he's letting be known. Now, you can't think, okay, wait. They asked him questions and now he's kind of answering. Do you think maybe they had said, what about us? We become Christians. How does marriage and Christianity fit? And so he just starts out getting very plain and basic in verses 1 through 5. He cautions them about being married because of the present distress. But now he begins to address more specifically. Married, you stay married. And shouldn't separate. But if it happens, Either remain that way or be reconciled one to another. Now verse 12, he says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever. So now the question is, okay, I became a Christian, I'm married, but my husband, my wife, is not married. What situations that put me in, Paul? He says, if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Once again, it's the same idea of you don't separate. Chapter 7, verse 10. You stay together. Verse 14, but if the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. I know sometimes we look at things, we're like, I'd like a lot more explanation for that. Yeah, I kind of would too, but I've got 10 more minutes and about 25 verses left. I have to say this. How many good wives, good women, found themselves married to a man that was not a Christian, and she remained faithful. And eventually, sometimes, and I've seen and known of it, sometimes taking 30 years or more, and he become a Christian. Or a man who's a Christian finds himself married to a woman who's not a Christian, but he remains faithful and he's true to what the Bible teaches, and it may take time, and eventually she becomes a Christian. And the children, having a Christian parent, learning what's right, learning what's wrong, learning why they ought to live right and shun the wrong. Maybe in this way, the husband, the wife made clean, the children made clean. But verse 15, it says, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. The King James Version has the phrase, not under bondage. And this has elicited all kinds of comments, all kinds of discussion over the years. And frankly, some have concluded, well, this must mean then, because of basically abandonment, the abandoned spouse, who's a Christian, can remarry. Because, see, that's usually a question. Can the person remarry? Well, I'd have to say this. Within this context, remarriage is not a discussion. So if we say, yes, he can remarry, we're actually putting some words, I think, in Paul's mouth. Secondly, I absolutely believe this with regards to whatever this says, it's got to be in harmony with what Jesus said about marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Mark 10 and Matthew 19. Now somebody might say, well, wait. Yeah, he left. And he found another woman too. Yeah, she left. And she found another man. And what you have then is what Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 19. There, one is not just guilty of abandonment, is guilty of fornication. And then, because of that, the right then to remarry. As I would say, go back and read Mark 10. Go back and read Matthew 19. Verse 16. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now verses 17 through 24, I have the heading that says, Live as you are called. And he makes mention of several things, being circumcised or uncircumcised, or being a slave or being freed. And, he basically comes down saying, wherever you find yourself, you live the Christian life. And then he gives a reason in verse 23. You are bought with a price. You find these same words in chapter 6, verse 20. Now, everything else is almost about marriage. This section, not so much. But I think that it's kind of like it's broader within its teaching. But within this context, I think it was clear. You're a Christian. You're not married. It's okay to stay that way. And maybe for the present distress, it's better to stay that way. By the way, present distress defined in terms of Corinth when this book was written. You find yourself married? That's okay. Stay that way. And live your Christian life in either circumstance. Now verse 26. Verse 26, now concerning. That's the second now concerning that you find within the book. And it's the second within this chapter. So apparently they were asking some things about marriage. And it says here, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Interestingly here, I think he's suggesting, I'm giving you an apostolic opinion. I have no command from the Lord, he says. I'm just giving he says, my judgment. Well, back over in verse 10, he says to the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. A charge over in one place, now just his judgment. And that's when he gets to this verse 26. I think in view of this present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. And now this section is dealing with, and now sometimes it's interpreted differently, but I think more likely, a Christian father, has a daughter of marriageable age. Should he marry her off or not? And then that's the discussion here. Present distress, maybe it's not the best time to do that. But on the other hand, he's already made himself clear. But if they cannot exercise control, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Chapter 7, verse 9. And that kind of overrides all that he tends to say. Now look down at verse 32. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. So here he's talking about, the unmarried, that's where they can give all of their energy, their time, their efforts over to the Lord. The married husband and wife, well, they've got to kind of be divided a little bit because they've got the Lord, but they've also got this husband and wife, and they have some very definite responsibilities in the marriage relationship. And so he's kind of coming down on, this would be a good reason too not to marry, so you can devote all of your time, energy, etc. to the Lord. I want to tell you something. As I read this, and I walk away from it, I'm thinking this. If somebody's idea of Christianity is I go to church on Sunday, and we'll use that kind of vernacular, they attend the assembly, they worship on Sunday. And then on Monday through Saturday, about the best they do is, I don't cuss. And God doesn't get much more attention than that. And they never open their Bibles. They do little to no praying. And God's not on their mind. They've also missed the point of this, haven't they? They missed the point about the one that's married and the one that's unmarried. Because God ought to concern us. God ought to be of concern to us every day that we live. And yes, there's a lot of things that kind of vie for our attention and grab at us. But still, God's got to be given our attention. Jumping down to verse 39, as we kind of have to hurry and stop. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now discussion comes up, well, does this mean she must marry only a Christian? This phrase, in the Lord, certainly can suggest that, but it does not always in every text suggest that. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Ha ha, I got it out. They're not Christians. I don't have to obey them. No. There it doesn't mean only if they are Christians. Not in Ephesians 6 with regard to parents. Rather it means, of course, as they have the expectations of you that the Lord would. As what they would teach and train you would be like the Lord would expect and want. Years ago, and many years ago, she came to church at Eastern Meadows and found out that she was from up above Cottondale, up kind of a little bit more towards the Vance direction. And she was living now in Montgomery. And it was just kind of interesting because when I was a little boy, my dad would take us and some other boys to swimming at Little Sandy Creek. Cold water came right out of springs just above the swimming hole. And she had been to Little Sandy Creek. Or was it Big Sandy? It's been so long I forgot. But then she told me something. She says her parents taught her to steal. Her parents taught her to steal. Well, that's not when you should obey your parents in the Lord, because stealing is not in the Lord. So, back to the widows. Could mean marry a Christian. Could just mean you marry according to what the Lord teaches. Then he finishes verse 40. Yet, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So, marriage. It starts out the marriage bed. The rest of the discussion, much of it, is should we marry? Just remember this. The key, I think, is what is your gift? I wish that all were as I myself am, verse 7. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind, one of another. Within the context, I think he's talking. Some have the need to marry, and that's okay. Some don't have the need to marry and never marry, and that's okay. Regardless, we are bought with a price, and we need to be serving our God, giving Him our undivided attention. If we can assist you in your obedience tonight, if you need to be immersed for the forgiveness of sins, if there's need for prayer, we'd be glad to take the time and pray for you.